Tell us a little bit about what you saw and being able to relay that message to Cora when you watched Kimbrel pitch and kind of help out so he wasn't tipping his pitches.
So tipping pitches, we hear about it all the time.
People at home understand what tipping pitches is all about.
It's amazing.
And that's remarkable.
Alex, bro, you missed the memo.
What memo?
The memo that you were supposed to show up to the Marvin Miller podcast with a mustache.
With a mustache. Fuck.
When are you going to bring the mustache
I always
back?
do this.
You
do this.
played around with it for a little bit in the pandemic. People don't know, but you did.
I did. I think...
What's going on?
I think it did not get the reception among some folks close to me that I thought it might. So I backpedaled. I'm sorry. I'm a coward. I stood down.
You got to power through, though, because at first...
I know, because it's like there's an awkward phase.
It's like a little wispy, you know? It's like not that inspiring.
Yeah.
Remember Bearded Alex era, like deep pandemic, when you came and visited me in LA? That was legendary stuff.
Those were dark times.
They were actually really dark times.
They were really dark times.
No, you missed the memo that you were supposed to show up rocking Marvin Miller's classic look.
I know.
The thing that he was so well known for, you know, better known than anything that got him into the Baseball Hall of Fame, apparently.
He kind of had some fits rocking.
Yeah, he had that shit on.
Old pictures of her.
No, he had that shit on.
Yeah, he was looking good.
You have to. When you're the face of organized labor in the sporting world, you have to make sure that it's a distinctive and suave and important feeling persona that you're putting off.
Mm-hmm.
You can't just look like a schlub, you know? Like no mustache, hat, white t-shirt, for example.
I'll do a social experiment and just dress like Marvin Miller for a week and then report back and see how different I feel.
Like see if people come up to you and they're like, sir.
Right.
I need your opinion on, you know, whatever is going on in the world.
I'm gonna be that guy who like walks down the street and is like, no one dresses like they should anymore, you know, in like a 3-piece suit or whatever. And it's like, frankly, this is the degradation of American society.
You're gonna be like the menswear guy, but worse.
Well, this is just trad content, is what it is, you know.
I think to promote trad, I've always said that about tipping pitches.
Yeah.
We're like trad content. That's what it is.
I wasn't saying this podcast.
No, I know. I'm just saying. One of the hosts is doing trad content on TikTok, apparently. You see, you're doing
horrifying
trad content.
String of words.
You're doing trad content on TikTok, and I'm doing Italian guy content on all platforms.
Mm-hmm.
This is how we grow the game. You know, this is how we go viral. This is how we make this a sustainable economic situation for us.
Yeah, well, you're on Blue Sky now, right?
I will never.
See, that's not true. That's not true.
What are you talking about?
We talked like a week ago, and you were like, "Here's the thing: is like, what if I do have to join Blue Sky?" And I was like, "Hang on, you can't let the listeners down like this. You've made a social contract with them."
Yeah, that's true, but not a financial one. Social contracts can be broken.
That's true. Yeah,
but
a handshake agreement.
Show me it in writing, you know?
I had my fingers crossed.
Gotcha. That's how Marvin Miller won the first CBA. He was like, he told all the owners, he sung them sweet songs. You know,
he was like, I was even crossing my toes.
No, I'm not going to Blue Sky. Sticking it out on XD Everything app, waiting for Mark Cuban to buy it. You know, something that was floated like for 3 hours a month ago, and I got stuck in my head, and I was like, he probably will do it, right?
Right.
That's how my brain works. And I'm committed to never making a TikTok account, and I feel so certified in that choice. Now, if you need to make like a TikTok account for the pod, I understand. Mm-hmm. But like a personal TikTok account where I like turn my phone around and say things to the phone, that will never happen. Just so you know.
I know.
The irony is that you would be such a great TikTok content creator if you committed to it.
I know. I dipped my toes in there for a little while.
I know, and they were good.
I
They were good
couldn't
TikToks.
I couldn't hang. I thought they were good toes, but Yeah, the TikToks are good too.
I'm not going to comment on your toes publicly. The Slack will go wild. This is a weird start to the episode about Marvin Miller in main character month. As listeners at home know, we spent the last couple weeks talking about main characters of the show for its 7-year run. Just people that we've ended up focusing on a lot, that we're intrigued by, that we're interested in, that we feel are not fully understood in the baseball conversation, at least not in the way that our particularly diseased brains understand them. So we kicked it off by teaching people Alex Rodriguez's rules to life, all the rules and how to succeed in life and business that Alex Rodriguez has posited into the universe in the last 3 decades that he's been a part of the baseball consciousness. Last week we talked about Robert Dean Manfred Jr. from Rome, New York, the historic site of Woodstock 99.
Don't you forget it.
You know what's going on right now? Korn is touring with System of a Down. Do you want to go?
Let's do it. When are they coming to New York?
We could. I doubt they are. We could, unless they're going to Rome, make a drive up.
Go to the old stomping grounds.
We could go to that show and we could invite Rob Manfred to come with us and we could make it a business expense.
Do you think he's ever listened to Korn?
Unfortunately, he probably has come across to Korn. I mean, he has a radio.
Oh, they're playing with Deftones too? All right, I'm in. I'm down.
I didn't know about that part. My sister informed me of this yesterday when we were driving down to Atlantic City to see a little band called the Front Bottoms. Alex, let me tell you, there was a lot of modern baseball shirts in the crowd. Yeah. It might shock you to learn.
Hey, they're playing at MetLife.
Are you for real?
Yeah.
Are you for real?
Yes.
I don't think I want to see Korn. Can we leave before Korn comes on?
Of course we can. Yes.
Okay,
that's
so
a time-honored tradition.
Deftones and System of a Down. I'm good with that plan.
Avenged Sevenfold, we sticking around or no?
Avenged Sevenfold?
Yeah.
We can stick around for that one song that they have. What's that? It's called
Nightmare.
No. Something about like a bat or something.
Something about a bat or something.
Oh, Bat Country. I was right.
Oh, all right.
I told you.
Okay, so we'll stick around for Bat Country and then we'll dip.
Right. Unclear when or if they will play that one song that I know by Avenged Sevenfold. Are you a big Avenged Sevenfold head?
Not really. I had like a moment, in I think like middle school or something like that, where I was like, wow, this stuff is deep, man. They're not just singing about like the normal stuff on the radio. They're talking about like fucking nightmares and skeletons and shit. I was like, oh my God.
It's to the point where I honestly don't know how more people are not obsessed with 11-year-old Alex. Like, just crushing Avenged Sevenfold. I'm not going to let it slide that you pronounced it Avenged Sevenfold.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know why I did that or why.
I don't know.
I kind of thought you might let it slide, but it's okay.
No. They wouldn't be doing my job. People at home are saying to themselves, "Did he say Avenged?" They were rewinding, and now it's a payoff. That's why I listen to the podcast.
Well, it's mostly just because I am used to referring to them as A7X, right? Their abbreviation. Like I usually don't say the full name.
Right. When you were posting their pirated files onto LimeWire, that's how
right. Right. When I was running fan pages.
The people don't know the histories of you and your fan pages, but we'll talk about that on the Patreon feed.
We will. Probably not this episode, though, because this is the Marvin Miller episode.
Bringing us back. Yes, we talked about Rob Manfred last week. We talked about his chronology, his timeline, how he got into baseball, what he was doing before, how that set him up to become the right-hand man of one Bud Selig, how that set up his tenure to become the commissioner, how he was the fixer turned commissioner, which you would never expect. It was a really good conversation. I quite enjoyed it. I do like to talk about Rob Manfred. I didn't think I would be approaching my 30s and still sharing opinions about Rob Manfred for the internet to listen to, but it seems like people like them. So here we are. This is the world that we've created for ourselves. And speaking of that world, Marvin Miller is one of the most important people in the world of tipping pitches. Marvin Miller, of course, the first executive director of the Major League Baseball Players Association, as they truly became a union and not just a players association that was within the bounds and influence of the owners, but something that was truly independent and a real union. And they fought for their first collective bargaining agreement under Marvin Miller. They went on their first strike while Marvin Miller was the executive director of the Players Association, although he recommended that they didn't. We're going to talk about that a little bit. We let people know last week that this episode was going to be about Miller and about kind of like his legacy, but really I was interested in talking about how he came to be such a compelling candidate for the Players Association, why they wanted to make him executive director. And part of that, a large part of that, was his experience in industrial unions with the steelworkers, and then prior to that in kind of negotiating deals during the Wartime Labor Board in various different industries, as the government had set up a situation. The government had set up a department where they were helping to mediate labor disputes during World War II because they didn't want, for example, the steelworkers going on strike while they needed to build tanks or bombs or whatever. And he had served on that board. And so he's just like this really interesting guy, with this really interesting life that led him to this point. And a lot of this actually comes from his autobiography, A Whole Different Ballgame, which I was pulling from a little bit for the background. But we had later in this episode, you're going to hear a conversation with my pal David Hill, who is a former organizer, a freelance writer, who has written a lot about labor and has a lot of experience in these worlds, talking about Miller's role, not only with the baseball industry and the sports and entertainment industry at large, but really kind of like his bona fides, like where he developed them, the labor context that Marvin Miller was coming into in the 1960s as he stepped up from chief economist of the Steelworkers to become the executive director of the MLBPA. Why did you want to talk about Marvin Miller? Aside from the obvious, I guess. What still compels you about doing a dedicated episode about him?
I mean, his story really is foundational to everything we talk about on this podcast, but it goes beyond that too, right? I mean, the work that he has had ripple effects throughout the world of broader organized labor. And frankly, he is kind of single-handedly the person who turns sports business into what it is today, right? This sort of thriving, and again, we'll talk about this with Dave, right? But sort of the reforms that he pushes for, in part, ferry baseball into the kind of modern era. And there are obviously outside forces that are interplaying with this and rising TV revenues.
Outside forces? Like the drones over New Jersey?
Stop. No. We're not doing this mass hysteria bullshit. But he is such an interesting character, especially with how he kind of approaches organizing this group of players. Because he does it in large part by just sort of treating them with respect and like humanity and saying, hey, I see you for what you are, which is workers. And you may agree with me, you may not agree with me. It's my role to basically just call it how I see it. And this is your union, so you can do with that information what you will. And his approach is just really fascinating to me in how he kind of backs into a lot of these conversations. He finds an issue that unifies them, that appeals to them, however small, and uses that as an opportunity to educate them more broadly about their rights as laborers and the power of collective action. And so, I don't know, we do a lot of sort of hand waving towards Marvin Miller and his legacy, but we have never really sort of, taken a deep dive into sort of what motivated him and what the context that he was organizing in looked like, because it's very different, obviously, from the context of baseball and labor today.
It's like hard to even wrap your arms around how different it really is. Like him coming from the Steelworkers, this ginormous union with all of this power in comparison to any union that we might have now, because the steel industry was still massively successful. It was still bolstered by regulation that was happening at the federal government level, which is something that we've just completely abandoned as a society, of course. And I mean, I think I gestured to this last week and I like the way that you said that we kind of wave our hands towards Marvin Miller without ever actually drilling down on any of the details. And I wonder if some people listening, like, kind of have internalized some of that stuff, but maybe don't even realize like how interesting of a life he lived and how interesting of a person he was. Professionally, but also personally. Like, if you read his book that I gestured to last week, A Whole Different Ball Game, which is an autobiography of his career told through the lens of Major League Baseball, how he got there and the changes that he made. And I didn't make it all the way through to the end before this because we just finished our last book club. But I was just even so struck about, like, he just has this very, and when you spend a lot of time in labor circles, like, it's cool to see that this is the type of person who succeeds in these kind of circles, because it's so rarely true. Like, bullshit artists succeed everywhere else, but like real honesty and transparency and a straightforward style of communicating is really rewarded in labor circles. And it's so refreshing sometimes to read something or to hear someone speaking who's just kind of like telling it like it is in a real way, not like telling it like it is to try to manipulate you. And I think that is what endeared him so much to not only the people who worked alongside him, like Donald Fear, and then became commissioner later on, and the professional class of people that he was working with, the economists, the people within the players union as they expanded their operation, but also the players themselves, like it's really hard to imagine like an economist rising to this rank and garnering this much respect with Major League Baseball players today. It's hard to imagine another Marvin Miller coming along. It has to be a pretty special person to be able to do that. And he was a pretty special person. And I think Dave did a really cool job of explaining kind of some of these different factors that were at play in his professional career that developed his labor leading ideology as well. Anything else to add on him and just kind of like where he stands in the baseball world before we go to our conversation with Dave?
Well, I mean, I'm glad you mentioned our book club that we had last week, right? We read Stealing Home by Eric Nussbaum, and
that was over on the Patreon feed, by the way.
Which is over on the Patreon feed. If you're, I encourage you to check it out if you haven't already. We had a really great discussion about the book, and we talked to Eric about his process in writing it. But I find myself actually thinking about that book a lot while preparing for this episode, because that book deals in large part, right? I mean, it's about the construction of Dodger Stadium, but like it's really not about that. It's kind of about all the forces that lead up to it. And a big part of that is the myth making around baseball, right? Mm-hmm. That baseball is this kind of like is on a higher pedestal than sort of other industries, other forms of labor, right? It is this national pastime. It has this storied history. It has this myth and ethos around it that makes it stand out from anything else. And this is a narrative that is largely pushed kind of from the top down, right? Because they recognize that the folks who are building this myth recognize that that's actually good for business. And Miller's work, frankly, is in large part unraveling a lot of that myth of baseball, not because he doesn't love baseball or doesn't believe in its power or anything like that, but precisely because he does love baseball, right? And he grows up a Brooklyn Dodgers fan. His father is a salesperson and his mom is a teacher, and he really, I mean, it feels like a bit of a trope to be like, oh, he's really drawing from these working class roots, but like he grows up going to Dodger games and seeing the players in person on the field, putting their labor on the line, putting their well-being out there for him, for the fan. And I think it does inform a lot of how he approaches organizing the players when he will eventually grow up. And I found it to be really a sort of interesting subplot of his story, right? Is in organizing these players, much of what he's having to do is roll back the last essentially 100 years of propaganda that has been written around this game and made the players believe that, they are not worth an organized labor movement.
Yeah, and what's fascinating and what's always made it interesting to talk about baseball through the context of labor for me on the show is that what's fascinating about the ownership propaganda that you're alluding to is that they're saying that baseball is sacred baseball can't sully itself by stepping into the world of organized labor, which is tough, which is tricky, which is morally complex for a lot of different reasons. It's interpersonally challenging when you have to fight with management. It's awkward. It's at the time in the 60s and the 70s, as we know, it's mafia affiliated in a lot of ways. It's violent throughout the history of organized labor in the United States, but also in the world. It's associated with quote unquote extreme political movements. It's associated with communism. We talked a lot about anti-communism and how that's the predominant ideology of America, but also of the concept of baseball as it is developed in the myth. And so all of these things being employed to suit owners' business interests, just don't think about all of those things. You don't have to think about all of those things. You don't have to put yourself through the challenge. You only have to think about baseball as the sacred thing that tells the story of America and papers over a lot of the problems itself because of its distinct beauty. And what Marvin Miller comes in and does, and maybe we go to our conversation with Dave after this because Dave talks a lot about this really effectively, I thought, is he comes in and he says, like, this is a job, and with a job comes dignity. You don't have to think about yourself as selling yourself as being a worker when you're a baseball player. You're not, just because you made it to the end of this very, very challenging road and you're this highly skilled person, you do feel lucky, but that's okay. You're allowed to feel lucky and you're allowed to feel like a worker and feel dignified in that fact. And that really resonated with me because honestly, the Players Association and other sports unions, the sports and entertainment industry, they're unions of like smaller amount of people than the tens of thousands of people in industrial and trade unions with highly skilled and highly specific labor, resembles a lot more of like Hollywood, the Hollywood writers, the Writers Guild of America, which I'm a member of. And so it's part of the reason why I'm so fascinated by all this stuff and so fascinated by Miller is because like he's able to translate a lot of the principles of the industrial and trade unions and the fights that they've put themselves through. And he's able to speak that language from there and place it in a place that actually economically is very different. But at the end of the day, what unites us is that we are all workers being exploited by capitalism. And so, I mean, Dave says this much more eloquently than I do and talks about it with a lot more experience than I have in terms of organizing different places in different contexts. But at the end of the day, like in the same way that you can tell the story of America through stealing home with the displacement, the public housing projects, the big business, the crooked politicians, all of these different things, you can also tell the story of America through Marvin Miller moving from the Steelworkers to the Major League Baseball Players Association and applying those principles too, if you think hard enough about it. And that's, I think, what we try to do with Dave.
Yeah, definitely. You mentioned A Whole New Ball Game is his autobiography, memoir. It's eminently
It's actually
readable,
a whole
right?
different ball game. I keep calling it a whole new ball game.
Okay, all right.
I do that too. I don't know why.
Right, A Whole New World. There's some. I don't know.
Think that actually might be it. Honestly.
Okay. Yes. No, but I mean, we talk about his kind of his moral clarity and his communication style. I think that extends to his reflections on his own work. And I don't know. I would encourage folks to read his book. It's a really fascinating tale, and he is able to kind of really effectively create a compelling narrative that still feels really accessible. I'll also just shout out that he also conducts an interview is interviewed by Faye Vincent for Saber's oral history collection. And I would encourage folks to check it out. It's like 3 hours long. It's a very sprawling discussion, but it's a really fascinating insight into this man who built baseball's labor movement.
Yeah, it's like an unofficial second Tipping Pitches book club. A whole different ball game to me is kind of like as seminal, maybe not as wide ranging, and doesn't go as long as something like Lords of the Realm, but is as seminal in understanding like the history of what was going on at the time and the different forces at work. It's obviously told from only one person's perspective, whereas Lords of the Realm is many different stories told from a third person perspective. But to me, it's a foundational text. All right, let's do it. We're going to go to our conversation now with David Hill, talking about Marvin Miller's legacy. But before we do, I am Bobby Wagner.
I'm Alex Baisley.
And you are listening to Tipping Pitches. Okay, we are now joined by David Hill, freelance writer, a labor veteran, and a friend of mine and a former coworker of mine. How you doing, Dave? How's it going?
I'm doing just fine, Bobby. How are you?
Pretty good. You know, I think the gambling world has really blown up since we worked on the show Gamblers a couple of years back now. A lot of conversation happening in that corner of the world.
Including a feature piece by me in Rolling Stone this month that people should go pick up and read.
That's exactly right. A wonderful feature piece, like a 10,000 long piece in Rolling Stone, which I saw some people talking about, and then I realized that you wrote it, and I was like, "Oh shit! Now I'm on board." But we're not here to talk about betting.
I assume it was about how the gambling industry has matured in the last couple of years since its infancy, and really grown to become a reasonable, rational industry. That we can rely on going forward.
It's got a little bit of everything. You know, I think somebody on Twitter called it the Canterbury Tales of the sports gambling industry. So
that's good. I like that. That's a good moniker.
It tries to look at the industry from like a bunch of different perspectives. So I spent a year hanging out with like professional gamblers, athletes, CEOs, bookies. I went down to Costa Rica and hung out with offshore brokers. So I did a lot of tried to look at it from a lot of different angles. And so you get a little bit of everything in this story.
Yeah, well, we certainly need that.
Well, we're not here to talk about gambling. We're here to talk about labor, the twin interest of your heart, Dave, labor and gambling.
My heart is big. It contains multitudes.
We're here to talk about Marvin Miller, of course, the original executive director of the MLB Players Association, a guy who we've spent a lot of time talking about on this show. But I think, Alex, correct me if you think I'm wrong, but our conversation has always been kind of limited to the particular foundation that he laid in the baseball world, like either from a collective bargaining agreement, contract language perspective, or just from a player hearts and minds perspective, radicalizing this group of conservative players that he was dealt at the beginning of his career in the MLBPA. But one thing about Marvin Miller is that he has this whole other, book-worthy career even before he gets into the baseball world. And then, of course, after he leaves the baseball world, after he retires and passes the Players Association on, the executive director role, he leaves a lasting legacy. And so, Dave, I wanted to have you on here to talk about a little bit about that, just because you are someone who I think of as being well-versed in the entire history of all the different types of unions as an organizer yourself, and the different personalities that each of these unions had. And of course, Marvin Miller spent 2 decades with the Steelworkers. And so I guess to kind of start us off here, I'm wondering, if we can sort of time travel back to the 1960s and put ourselves in the mindset of someone who had spent 20 years working at the Steelworkers. Why would he want to leave that situation and take over the MLB Players Association? Kind of like what was going on in sports and labor at the time that it would make it a compelling thing to try to push the labor movement forward for someone who was so enmeshed within it?
Well, he didn't want to, is kind of the answer to that. He didn't want to lead the Steelworkers. Miller had worked his way up to the top of the Steelworkers. He originally was hired by them as a researcher, sort of a lowly researcher. He had an economics degree, and I think from NYU, and he had worked for a number of different labor unions at that time. His first job was that he was a mediator for the War Labor Board during the war, right? He couldn't fight in the war. He had some sort of birth defect that kept him out of service. So he worked for the War Labor Board and kind of mediated deals between management and various labor unions. And then he ended up working for the Steelworkers and worked his way all the way up to become kind of the top, essentially he was their chief economist, but he really was a negotiator. He did a lot of the negotiating with Steelworkers. And at that time, the Steelworkers were, I think, the largest union in America, or they were one of the 2 largest unions in America. Steel was still a big industry in America. And what was interesting about Miller's role there was that negotiating with the companies all had an association. Like you essentially were negotiating with the government, right? Like steel prices and all this. Steel was purchased by the U.S. government. The government set a lot of these rates. It's just sort of a different world back then. And so he was really negotiating, coming up with negotiating strategies to sort of leverage the government and the companies and the workers all against each other to make sure that the workers got their fair share. So he had quite a lot of power and influence in that union. But as happens, those of us who've been in the labor movement, worked in it, or held elected positions in the labor movement before know these are dynamic democratic organizations. So the president of the Steelworkers, who was Miller's mentor, lost, and a new president was coming in, and Marvin Miller started looking for a new job because there was going to be a new regime, and he actually was offered a teaching position at Harvard, which I think is what he really wanted to do. He wanted to teach at Harvard. That was a big deal for him to go and do that, and the Players Union, the MLB Players Association, I guess they really weren't even a union technically at that point. Were looking for a new director, and they had a committee that was putting a lot of candidates together to interview. Most of the people that they were interviewing were like lawyers and whatnot. I mean, the guy who had been their executive director, like their first executive director, was a lawyer who was like a management side lawyer who had represented all the companies. So like they just sort of had a lot of
wild.
Right. They had all these bums that had run the organization that were sort of management side. And they were, the list of people that they were talking to, there was like this Judge Cannon, who was like a well-known judge who was also the owners loved, he was very close to the owners. So there were no union candidates on this list. And Miller was the one union candidate. And I can't remember, there was somebody who I think had suggested him to the committee, some lawyer or some, labor relations sort of person who'd said, this is a good guy. He's looking for a job. You should talk to him. And Miller was not interested in this job at all. To him, it did not seem nearly as interesting as teaching at Harvard. And the story is that he went into the interview, kind of wanting to tank it, like he didn't want to do it. But he left the interview. When he left the interview, he said that he suddenly found himself wanting the job really bad. And the reason why he decided that he actually wanted it was that he kind of saw that the MLB Players Association was a bit in disarray, and that there was a lot of problems that the association needed to take on, and that they really had no ability to do any of it, right? And so what Marvin Miller had said was, all I could do at this job is improve it. Like there's no way to fail because it was already so bad.
The bar is so low to start.
Right. So he was like, I can only make this place better, which would be great. I think he thought that he could go in for a few years and that it was an interesting proposition to him. Like he had said, like, it's a once in a lifetime opportunity is what I think he said. Like this is a rare opportunity to basically get to go build something up from scratch, to build something from the ground up that can actually be powerful. He saw that's the other piece of it, is that he saw the pieces there that they actually could win, that they had a lot of leverage and they could be powerful if they did this right. And so I think that his wheels started turning, and he realized like all these kind of like corporate lawyers who they're interviewing and all the people who've run this association in the past have really failed to appreciate the real leverage and power that this association could have to win real gains. They're not, they don't get what they have, and I do. And I think I'm singularly the person here in this mix that could take this association and make them powerful. So then he started really lobbying for it, and he didn't get it. Like they didn't recommend him at first. The committee went with Judge Cannon, who I then asked for too much money. So then they, had to keep moving down the list, and the owners were really trying to tank Marvin Miller, because the owners still were funding the association at that time and had some say in this. So they really did everything they could to try to sabotage him. But in the end, he managed to win.
I think it's hilarious that as soon as the like sort of labor expert actually enters the room, Marvin Miller enters the room with the players, all of a sudden the owners realize they're violating Taft-Hartley. They're like, oh, actually, we are not allowed to be funding this union anymore, which is maybe the first sign that something is very deeply wrong, right? That the wool has kind of been pulled over your eyes for years. This ostensibly player-centric organization that thus far has really, the only gains they've achieved are a sort of measly pension and some healthcare benefits, right? But it's a testament to like how backwards that landscape was. But it's also, as you mentioned, a very radically different from the steelworkers in that it's maybe 500 people, right? That he's organizing, that are often really in disparate, sort of far-flung places. I mean, when he's sort of entering that, coming from the steelworkers, this really organized, huge, I think they had 1.2 million members at that point or something like that. I mean, what is that sort of like? From your perspective, going from this highly organized, really powerful, frankly, really wealthy union that has done really well for their members to kind of come and say, I'm starting from scratch here. Like from your perspective, how do you think that he kind of approached that?
Well, I experienced some of this myself in a much smaller and lower stakes situation where I actually was a organizer for the United Auto Workers, and I was working with the UAW to organize auto workers in the South, and I went from there to working for the Writers Guild of America East, which was a very small union of very professional kind of, it's like craft union. I mean, it was a union it was a guild essentially that was represented very highly skilled workers in the entertainment industry. And really just
like
sort
me,
of,
right?
Yeah. Well, at the time I went to work for them, schmucks like you didn't belong to the union. It was actually a bunch of screenwriters and TV writers who utilized the union as a way to defend their very high, labor standard and to kind of protect these highly paid jobs for themselves. Schmucks like you came in and really threw that union for a loop and turned it into something different and much cooler, than what it was at that time.
We can save that conversation for the Patreon episode, Dave.
But it was an interesting change because I think I saw some of the same types of things where when I went into the guild, I realized, this is a small union. They don't have the UAW had $1 billion in the bank. The Writers Guild maybe had $5 million in the bank. It was there's a very small number of staff that worked in office. There were 5,000 members or something. But within the context of that industry, the Writers Guild held a lot of power and was a lot of leverage. And so this is sort of a different way of thinking about it. This is industrial unionism as it exists in sort of manufacturing in the United States requires you to have lots and lots of workers. You sort of unionized at key parts of the sort of whatever the supply chain, the way that the manufacturing process, and you sort of apply leverage by threatening to strike or whatever. But it was the calculus is different when you're talking about things like these kind of craft unions, these small guilds where the workers are highly skilled and only certain people, in theory, right? Only certain people can do this job. This is what the baseball players union had, right? It's a small number of people who were the best in the world at what they did and held a lot of bargaining power, even as individuals, but definitely collectively. And so I think that Miller maybe saw that what the steelworkers had was powerful, industrially speaking, but within this context of baseball, this small group of workers were even more powerful and could probably do a lot more, and in the end did do a lot more over the course of his tenure. Salaries were $19,000 the average salary when he took over the players union, and when he left it was something, the average salary was something like $600,000 or something, right? So this is an amazing transformation of this work that happened through forming this union of this very small number of players.
Yeah, I mean, I think from someone who is that smart, savvy, militant, has been in these many circles, to see an opportunity like that, if you're a true labor leader like Marvin Miller turned out he was, it's almost like you can't turn that opportunity away. This is an industry that needs this. This is an industry that is begging for someone to come in and apply their set of skills, and his particular set of skills was so beneficial to baseball because he understood the economics of the game, having been in different industries and having negotiated during the Wartime Labor Board. He had, I'm sure, been privy to all of this information about how different industries work, and he had an economics degree and all these things that the Players Association was just never even considering. I mean, the pension was given to the Players Association as a way to stave off the Mexican League trying to attract players away because they were willing to pay higher salaries to bring stars down to Mexico around the turn of the 20th century. And MLB was like, okay, we're kind of screwed if we lose all of our best players to this Mexican League just because people are going to pay more money down there. And so that was why they even had the pension to begin with. And that's not how you win a good pension, right? That's Amazon offering $1.50 more so that you won't sign the union card and start organizing their factories. Like, these are incremental wins that are almost sort of like a pittance to workers to prevent them. And so, I don't know, I imagine for someone like Marvin Miller coming in there, that opportunity to like really make big strides and big wins and show that you can build something from the foundation up. It's really compelling. It's almost like compulsive for someone who really cares about the labor industry.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I think what Marvin Miller's mostly remembered for is, like I already mentioned, the dramatic increase in salaries, but also free agency and the elimination of the reserve rules in baseball. That's what his legacy kind of is. But interestingly enough, the reason that the MLB Players Association wanted a new executive director and looked for somebody who could help them was because of the pension plan. And in the 1960s, defined benefit pensions were really taking shape and becoming a big deal in American society. And companies that had defined benefit pensions, like Major League Baseball, but really a lot of industries in America, they were maintained by the employers. And the workers who participated in these pensions sometimes were asked to make contributions. This all sounds like ridiculous to us today because we don't have pensions and we all contribute our own money to 401ks. But back then, like, people were putting their own money into these pension plans. They had no idea what was happening with that money. They had no idea what was going on with it. They had no say in it whatsoever. And it was unions, it was the labor movement that started to create these Taft-Hartley, which is a pension plan where the employer and the workers manage it together, right? Where there's sort of an equal number of people on the board that make all these decisions about the pension, and that the union has an important role in helping manage all that. That all kind of came out of the labor movement. The pension plan in baseball was not, the players had no say in it at all, and they were pretty sure they were getting ripped off. That was what sort of precipitated this whole thing about bringing Marvin Miller in. It was his first thing that he worked on. And he was able to figure out that the players or the teams were stealing money out of the players' pension plans. And he was able to negotiate a new pension plan where the employers would make all the contributions. And the leverage he had on them wasn't that they were threatening to strike. It wasn't that the players were going to walk or whatever. It was that he found that they were stealing the money, and he used that as leverage. He said, look, I can either drop a dime on you guys for breaking the law and taking this money, or you can just give us this, what we want, and give us a pension plan where you fund the pension plan and the players don't fund it themselves. And interestingly enough, they won that. And then he got rid of their dues and took their pension contributions and gave that to the union. So the players also thought that they were making more money because they thought that they no longer had to pay dues to the union. So it was really brilliant. It was really brilliant.
This is someone who understands the political machinations that it takes to not only succeed when you're negotiating, but also build something from the ground up, and understand that, like, usually if you turn over some stones, you'll find the management is full of crooks, and that is usually pretty decent leverage, Well, there's this old saying in the labor movement. We used to say, nobody organizes workers better than the boss. And what that saying means is that often we'd find ourselves we'd find ourselves in an organizing fight or whatever kind of fight, and like the boss would end up doing something so outrageous or stupid or or evil that it would bring workers to the union without the union even trying. Like, that's what and that happened here too, where the you mentioned before that he took over a union of like conservative workers, right? That the players were not that, they weren't radical, they weren't necessarily all that pro-union. Yeah. And that's true to a degree. I think really it was more so, it wasn't so much that they were conservative, it was that players and really everyone in America had really internalized this idea that baseball was a game and that it wasn't a business. In fact, the Supreme Court had also sort of reinforced that by saying that this is not interstate trade or whatever, that there's, sport
that there were
not trade was the phrase that they
sport
used.
Not trade. So like this whole idea that like, this is all very silly. These are grown men playing a child's game, that they're very lucky that they're getting anything at all. Everybody had internalized this idea, right? So that was what he was really up against. Was, I wouldn't call it conservative. That's just sort of was the way that people thought about sports, right? That there was not a good, a very sophisticated understanding of sports as business is what he was really up against. They didn't go on strike till 1972. Like he did a lot in those first, 12 years without ever going on strike or even ever threatening to go on strike. There was a lot of cooperation and like playing nice with management and whatnot. In 1972, when they go on strike, he actually in 72 recommended to the players not to go on strike. Miller tried to talk them out of it. And the players said respectfully, we don't care what you say. We want to go on strike because they were so offended at the teams and what the teams were essentially offering or not offering. How hard the teams were playing. We're not going to give you 1 cent. You don't deserve it. You've gone too far already. And the players sort of kicked into this competitive mode, and they wanted to fight. And Miller couldn't even talk him out of the fight. At a certain point, he realized the wind is all blowing at their backs, and I'm just going to let it blow. And they have this big strike in 72, and they won, and they got everything that they wanted. But his inclination was, we're not ready to strike. We need to spin. We're not at this place yet. He tried to talk them out of it. So, really, it is that the owners did so much more to help build what the players union into an actual union than Marvin Miller ever did. And I think that there's this idea that he was some sort of radical that went in and radicalized these workers, but really it was that he went in and made them think of themselves as workers, and then the boss did all the rest.
Yeah, he really is an organizer in the truest sense of the word, right? Because he doesn't come in and start agitating for strikes. He recognizes the landscape is a little fraught, and to your point, it's the American people generally, and then baseball players specifically, have been propagandized for so long to think that again, you're playing a child's game, you're lucky to be here, the kind of dumb jock trope, right? And he really just comes in and kind of treats them with dignity and says, "Hey, I work for you." And the 1972 strike is, I think, the perfect sort of example of that, of his power, right? Of I'm not coming in here to sort of intentionally, lead a quote unquote revolution, so to speak. I'm just, sort of showing you what you guys already have. And I think he looks back on that. When he reflects on these stories, he thinks fondly of moments like that, right? A grin creeps across his face, because that's what you want as an organizer, right? It's your class of laborers says, no, respectfully, we're getting screwed over here. And
I think
no good organizer is the first person to say the word strike, right? You want
Right.
the union themselves, the members, to democratically lead that. And if you have to drag them kicking and screaming towards it, it's not going to be a fucking good strike. And I think he knew that.
Yeah.
What radicalized them, I think, was him making them understand or think of themselves as workers. I think that all these baseball players had this internal sense that they were probably getting screwed in one way or another, and that they might be worth more. But they were tamping that down, you know what I mean? And they were saying, "Oh, whatever, I'm lucky. And it was him making them realize that you are getting ripped off. You are a worker. They're making profits off of your labor and nothing else, right? It's at this point, the owner's profits is 100% your labor because of how little they're paying you. Another interesting thing that he did early on was this. You guys probably have talked about this before, but with baseball cards and stuff like that, where he also got them to think about how they had value, their likeness being licensed out to baseball cards and whatever different types of advertising was also worth a lot more, because they were getting screwed on that front too. So across the board, getting these baseball players to realize their worth is what radicalized over that course of that 12 years, is why in 72 they were willing to demand and willing to go on strike for their demands, because by that point they really started to fully understand what they were worth. And it took that long of a process for them to get there. But it all started, the initial sort of switch that had to get switched on was Marvin Miller coming in and saying, you're a worker, this is labor, this is business. What we're doing here is business, and you're the worker in this business. And that sounds obvious to us today, but I think in 1960, it was not obvious. People did not think of sports that way at all.
No, and he's shocked when he comes in. He's these are simultaneously the most exploited, some of the most exploited laborers I've ever seen. And again, some of the most propagandized. You don't even realize it, right? He's shocked when no one brings up the reserve clause when he's going around and meeting teams.
I think he said that they were more exploited than the steelworkers that he worked for, right? And just people should understand that when he says that, obviously, he doesn't mean they make less money. They make more money. They make a lot more money. But his idea of exploitation isn't about how much money somebody's being paid. It's about to what degree is someone being taken advantage of, right?
Yes.
To what degree is it? And that's what he meant was these baseball players are absolutely getting screwed in terms of how much money they're generating for the people that own these teams, their bosses versus the steelworkers, right? I think he saw the gap there. The degree there was much higher.
There's a subtle difference in the way that I think the word exploitation or exploiting is used in labor circles versus how it's used kind of qualitatively in day-to-day life. Exploitation is not the same as suffering. Like management will use the word exploitation all the time. We want to exploit your labor in order to make profits because we are taking the risk on the capital side. This is how capitalism works. These are the dynamics that if you are the chief economist of the steelworkers, you understand. If you're a baseball player who's only ever played baseball and only ever cared about making it to the majors, you never have cause to think about. And so that perfect mending of his experience, his ideology, coming to an industry that needs it so bad, but also has so much to go. They're on the floor and their ceiling is so much higher. Whereas like the steelworkers, the ceiling is not as high, but they've already raised their floor. You know, they've already been organized for decades. I wonder, Dave, like for you, from your perspective, like 1960 is like a really fascinating time in American labor, because I think during the 40s and the war and World War II, like labor evolved a lot because of that war and the time period coming out of it. They had that was kind of like the introduction en masse to no strike, no lockout clauses. And so for a long time, there was kind of like this mediated version of trade union negotiations, industrialized negotiations, because they just wouldn't go on strike because they would jeopardize the war effort. And management had agreed not to lock, places like the steelworkers out for that time period too. And Marvin Miller was working in that industry at that time. But then by 1960, that's kind of changed a little bit. Unions have reverted back to going on strike to gain leverage with regularity, or almost automatically going on strike when a contract ends so that they can exercise their leverage. But then also we think about like sports weren't really unionized yet in America. Like the major sports, like the Baseball Players Association was the first one to really do it. And now, of course, we know that every major professional sports association has a union that is like in this model, even if they haven't gotten as far as this, like the NFL Players Association, for an example. But I wonder if you could talk a little bit about like the 60s, like pre-Nixon, and we still have like a lot of really tough, really bitter, but really like impassioned and popular, honestly, in the national consciousness, labor fights to come in the 60s and 70s before Reagan comes in and kind of fucks over a lot of these efforts in the 80s. But Marvin Miller was like right in the middle of that. So, I mean, what do you think about that time period?
It's an interesting time period. I mean, the labor movement in America in the 1960s was really the forefront of the American labor movement was workers that worked in manufacturing, right? So the large industrial unions and also the Teamsters Union were kind of the major unions in the American labor movement. And a lot of Americans worked in manufacturing at that time. And so a lot of, unions touched a lot of Americans' lives. We've never in America had a big, strong labor movement like other, industrialized countries have. It's always been sort of a minority share of the workforce. It's always been, relatively weak. But the 60s was a period of relative strength for the labor movement. And there was a lot of support from government, right? And that mattered because a lot of the industries that were unionized were also heavily regulated, right? So the Teamsters Union, for example, Jimmy Hoffa negotiated this master freight agreement in the 60s. And this was a major watershed event for that union and for truck drivers and for the labor movement. That came through getting the federal government through regulation to set, by pressuring the government to set rates or whatever, and using that as leverage to get the employers all kind of in line behind a master agreement. So there was this there was sort of this tripartite agreements that happened between the federal government, the labor unions, and the industries that they were organizing. So the government, I think, helped a lot during that period of time. And, that sort of goes on until the Nixon years, right? Where things start to change under the Nixon administration, just not really dramatically. I mean, Nixon was not a super anti-union president. The Teamsters actually endorsed Nixon for completely different reasons, right? Because they were, mobbed up or whatever. But but it was the beginning of what then takes place in during Carter's administration and then into the Reagan administration that you alluded to, where the federal government decides they're completely out, not only on unions, but also on regulation of a lot of these industries, which were then deregulated, right? Trucking, airlines, a lot of these industries got deregulated, and that actually hurt some of those industrial unions' power. And going into the 90s, where then we just offshored everything. So the fact that the American labor movement was rooted in industrial kind of manufacturing workers meant that that's where that base was in the 60s, and that's what disappeared from the American economy. They could never figure out how to pivot, right? Sports and entertainment have been the exception to the rule, where America, the one industry in America today that is like pretty well, organized and unionized wall to wall are sports and entertainment, right? That's where unions have been able to continue to hold real influence and sway, and by the way, create a product that is incredibly profitable for all of those businesses, right? Movies, television shows, and professional sports. So this was the beginning of that too. Marvin Miller is really the tip of the spear. He is the very beginning of the idea of sports as business and athletes as workers. He begins a process that is continuing to this day with not just minor league baseball players today they're organizing, but college athletes and everything that we're seeing happening among NCAA athletes. It all tracks all the way back to Marvin Miller telling those baseball players in 1960 that they're workers and they should have a collective bargaining agreement. It all begins. And so it's really a long, he starts a long path here that's still going on and has been very, pretty consequential in not only that industry, but in sort of, popular culture and, the way that we think about sports all over the world.
I'm wondering, sort of as we, continue this conversation, how the role of media sort of plays into his efforts, especially at that time, right? Because you have a sort of class of sports journalists who are not labor journalists, right? Who have covered this game for years, and are honestly, I think, a little bit peeved that there's this kind of man who all of a sudden is creating these headlines that they don't really know how to cover. Can you just sort of talk a little bit about what that atmosphere was like that he was sort of going up against, not only against management but kind of in the media?
Yeah, it frustrated Marvin Miller to no end that the journalists that were covering things like the 1972 strike were sports writers and that so essentially, for people who don't know how media works, right? Like a lot of newspapers would have many different desks and different editors and teams of reporters and journalists that worked in a particular whatever, like in a particular sphere of news. And so sports was, there were sports writers that covered sports. And when there was a strike in baseball in 1972, most newspapers in America assigned that story to their baseball writers. And these baseball writers were in no way equipped to understand what the hell was being, debated. I mean, a lot of the articles at the time just called it, that would reduce the strike and the fight over to a health or a benefits plan, right? Which made it sound like it was a single issue, simple thing. Why can't these rich players get over it and figure out a solution to the benefits plan? When in reality, it was a fight over, essentially their entire, livelihood. So he really was frustrated by that. And he tried to get papers to send labor journalists that he had worked with before with the steelworkers to come and cover this from the labor point of view. And he said, and some journalists did, and those were the better stories, right? But this was a process, and it was one that was naturally going to happen. And it sort of started with that strike, but it continued on all the way through the 80s and on into trying to get people to see labor conflict and battles in sports, not as a sports story. And there's really no reason why any sports journalist would need to try to, this is a labor story. This is an economic story. And so that's, I don't think that we still deal with this today. I pitched a story to the New York Times about the, recently the Starbucks workers have been organizing all over the country, and all of the major, all of the sports unions in America, all the major league unions, all signed a letter that they wrote to the Starbucks CEO. And every single union, baseball, football, soccer, all of them, they signed this letter supporting the Starbucks workers and asking for them to come to the table and negotiate a deal. I thought this was a good story. So, I pitched it to the New York Times. They couldn't figure out what desk to sign it to. And they were asking me, is this a sports story? Is this a labor story? And what's interesting is that when I was thinking about it, I thought, I think it should be a sports story. And the reason why I thought it should be a sports story was because I wanted readers of the sports page to be the ones to read that story. But that was me thinking as a organizer who's on the side of labor and not necessarily as a journalist, right? But I thought this is the audience that needs to hear this, right? That professional, NFL players are standing out on the picket line with Starbucks workers. That's something that I think sports fans need to be thinking about, right? And understanding that their heroes are also, rank and file union members who see common cause with Starbucks baristas. That wasn't something, but I can understand the dilemma that that an assigning editor might have with a story like that.
I mean, I think it's really fascinating that you see just these problems that are kind of never ending in the way that labor gets talked about in the sports industry. Like, I think back to the coverage of the most recent lockout, and we're still seeing the same things that we were seeing in 1994. We're still seeing the same talking points that we're seeing in 1972 with the players' strike. Because I think that, honestly, if I had to diagnose it, it's that these baseball writers, like, what made their baseball writing so essential and so beloved was that they are like slipstreaming into the myth of baseball. And the myth of baseball is the thing that Marvin Miller is trying to undercut to get people to realize that you don't need to be giving up your leverage just because you get to participate in this thing that has had so much myth making put into it for the last 75 years. And so it kind of like, it calls into contrast, it calls into question, honestly, what is the underlying thesis of everything, of the way that we've been covering this game for the last 70 years? Should we have been thinking more about the exploitation that's been going on in this industry? Should we have been thinking more about the people who originally tried to challenge the reserve clause and the Supreme Court getting involved and siding on behalf of the owners who at the time are not billionaires, but are the equivalent of our modern day billionaires? But even now, like, I saw very little labor coverage that effectively explained like what a lockout is and why it happens, and how there are only a certain number of levers that either union or management can pull on to advance negotiations. We all hear about how there's a stalemate. They're not even talking. And then fans just get really mad. They don't really understand why you wouldn't come to the table and start negotiating and give up your leverage before you have to. These are just things that, like, if you don't have personal experience with it, and yet 50 years later, like, we're still not really seeing it covered that way. And I wonder why that is, except for the fact that I just think about how media unions have just been decimated and how a lot of this coverage is not being done by people who have personal experience with this.
Well, I would say two things. One, I think that, media unions are being decimated by media being decimated right now. But the idea of media unions is greater today than it ever has been, right? That there actually has been a lot that's happened within digital media for them to get unionized. And, people like yourself really did a lot of, showed a lot of courage to unionize a lot of digital media shops over the last, 10 years. But I think that's important because the reason that I think people struggle to understand the sort of the nuance or even report on it or sort of understand it when they're reading about it is because Americans don't have a lot of experiences with unions. I mean, unions are at their lowest point today than they ever have been. I mean, this is like less than, something like 6% of the private sector. I mean, it's essentially nothing, right? Like the unions have really been defeated. And so that means that people, even though we live at a period of time when more people than ever say they support unions, right? We have like 70% of American population saying that they support unions. They would even like to have a union where they work, but fewer people than ever have them. So this is sort of a weird moment that we live in. But where we see this play out with sports and athletes unions is that, yes, people don't understand what a lockout is. Yeah, they don't understand what the sort of, in the machinations are that are going into these disputes. Sports fans especially, who understand a lot about sports but don't understand a lot about the business of sport. But people understand more about the business of sports than they ever did before. And people have these sort of parasocial relationships with athletes. And I think, from my point of view, today, I think there's a lot more sympathy for athletes on the business side of things than ever before. This idea that they're all rich, overpaid, whiny, complaining like spoiled brats, that feels today like an anachronistic attitude. Like when you hear somebody or see somebody complaining about an athlete being like, or whining about their money being like, spoiled or whatever, you immediately assume that's like a boomer or something, that's some like old guy, that, like it feels like an anachronistic attitude to have. Today, people seem to really support athletes in this fight and understand that they're being underpaid and undervalued by these teams a lot of times. And that even extends to collegiate athletes where, we used to do this workshop back when I was at the UAW, we would do these workshops with members where we would try to get members together to debate controversial issues that weren't like union issues, to get them to think about how to have hard conversations. And one of the things that we would do in this workshop is we'd have them debate whether or not college athletes should be paid. And this is way before, this is like in 2009 and 10. And in the beginning, that was a very people would fight until they were, they had strong opinions on both sides of this argument. They would fight each other about it. And then a couple of years later, we noticed that like nobody was fighting about it. In fact, everybody was taking the same position, and it wasn't controversial anymore. And now it's like today, so I kind of think that what the way we thought about professional athletes and thinking about them has now trickled down even to collegiate athletes. And this would not have been possible, 50 years ago. So we are sort of seeing progress in thinking about athletes as workers and thinking about professional sports and even amateur sports as business where people are being exploited. I think the average fan has come a long way on how they think about that. But you're right. The employers definitely trot out the same arguments time and time again. I just think they're finding less and less purchase as years go on. And I think that athletes unions should take advantage of that if they at all are inclined to.
I think it's in large part because of the idea that you were talking about earlier, which is that the bosses organize the workers as much as anyone. The bosses organize the fans as much as anyone too. Like we've seen
absolutely
the change in the ownership class, honestly, has made fans much more radical against owners than ever. It's like, it's no longer Bill Veeck trying to own a baseball team, or even, more controversial owners like Charlie Finley trying to own a baseball team, where it's like, this is their business, right? Like, so even if they're fucking it up, like they're fucking up their own business. If now it's like, if you're fucking up baseball, you're fucking up like your fourth business, it's like, it doesn't even matter. We have the Forbes billionaires list. We know that this is not how you made your money. You inherited it from fucking Chick-fil-A or Walmart or whatever. So like, we know that we actually have more information about where to place our priorities and where to place our affiliations, I think, which is helpful in terms of the attitude. But again, like, has it done much? I don't actually know. Like, are sports unions stronger now than they were in the heyday of Marvin Miller? Do they have a better attitude towards the industry, or have the edges kind of been sanded down? I don't know. We could probably debate that for a long time.
They probably do, if you look at how much they're able to really dip their hand into the deals that make the billions of dollars for these leagues, then I would say they probably do have more power. But they probably don't have as much power as the union did at a time when like the players really identified with the union, right? So one of the things that was kind of cool about the players union under Miller was that, and this is really a product of it all being very new, right? Was that the players during that time felt such tremendous, like, they really identified with the union as their union. They saw Marvin Miller as their leader. They wanted to protect him and fight for him and fight for each other. And that, I think, went away over the years. And this is something that I think happens in all industries. And you've probably experienced this yourself. As an organizer, I would find all the time that workers who organize their union, who bring a union into a non-union shop and really have to walk through that fire to bring a union shop, end up really not taking it for granted and thinking it's very important, and being more involved, and also like, really not, like I said, not taking for granted. But workers who go to work at a job that's already union, where the union's been there for 40 years, whatever, they sometimes they will take it for granted, or they'll even be overly critical of the union and really not, make any excuses for it, because to them, they didn't have to sacrifice anything to get it. Everything that those workers fought for, they got it just by getting hired at the job, And so I think there's a little bit of that among athletes today, where athletes today probably don't appreciate what athletes before them really had to go through in order to get even the ability to dip their hand into those deals. And that's what I think might be suffering. And we saw that in the NBA, where there was a real divide between superstar players and the players union, we see a little bit of that in certain sports. And I think that's the real shame of it, is that that hasn't really continued.
Yeah, I mean, there's a really sort of you mentioned the 1972 strike when the players basically vote against him, and it's this really striking moment when the players sort of have said, yes, this is our union, we're going to do. And the other kind of moment that really stands out to me in that period is with Curt Flood, right? Who again wants to go to the Supreme Court and challenge the antitrust exemption, and Miller advises him not to do it, not because he doesn't think it's a worthy cause or anything like that, but because he says, look, like, this is going to destroy your career. It's 1,000,000 to 1 chance. They have already ruled multiple times that, baseball is exempt from these antitrust laws. And Flood basically looks at him and says, but is it going to help my teammates? Is it going to help the players who come after me? And Miller says yes, and Flood says, okay, then I'm going to do it. And it's this really striking sort of political moment that obviously speaks to Flood's kind of nature and resolve as a person, but also the solidarity that had been fostered there, right? That I think Miller did so well to cultivate. where these guys really did feel like they were fighting on behalf of each other and not just for themselves. And I do think that's something that you, as you pointed out, like it's a little harder to see that sometimes in labor dynamics today.
Yeah, another axiom we used to have when I was an organizer was that you can't want it more than the workers do, right? And you can't be like, you can't, if you find yourself really trying to like push somebody to do something hard, to the degree that like they, that you're, that it seems more important to you than them, then it's probably a bad move. And I think that what was cool about Marvin Miller was, he really just sort of made it plain for folks and laid it all out there and said, this is why what we're doing today is going to be better for for you. But this is why but then you really have to invest yourself in making sure it's going to be better for the people after you, because the guys that came before you didn't do it for you, and that's also part of why you have this lot. And that worked. And there was a generation of these ball players who really tried to fight for the guys coming behind them. But that has a law of diminishing returns because, like I said before, you end up with a generation who didn't have to fight and did end up getting a pretty good deal from on day one. And it becomes harder to get them to understand that, like, this was a product of a fight. Now, you didn't have to have that fight, but at some point you might have to. And it might be a fight that you're having for a future generation. It's just a hard thing to convince American workers to do. And unions in all industries have struggled with that, to get American workers to think not about what's in your paycheck this week, but what's going to be in somebody's paycheck, 10 years from now, 15 years from now, whatever. That's why we have two-tier systems. And that's why we have a lot of industries where unions have really decertified, because it's hard to get American workers to think about the people that come after them.
It turns out that rugged individualism was a very compelling argument for people in a country where it was founded on life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, purportedly. But like, I want to end on talking a little bit about, you wrote the memoriam, the obituary for Marvin Miller in Grantland in 2012, I believe, was when Marvin Miller passed. And you talked a lot about this idea of tension, that Marvin Miller created tension in an industry that needed it. Like, there were problems, and in order to solve problems, it's what you're talking about, Dave. You have to have difficult conversations. You have to be willing to walk through the fire. You have to be willing to sacrifice for the person next to you and put yourself in opposition to management, because that is the dynamic that capitalism demands. It's labor versus management at the table. It's a zero-sum game. Like, if it doesn't go to you, it goes to them. It's not going to some charitable export or something like that. And I thought it reminded me a lot of when Marvin Miller got inducted into the Hall of Fame in 2020, because this was something that I think a lot of people were really the idea of him getting into the Hall of Fame was like a really torturing idea, because like they wouldn't want him in there. The owners wouldn't want him in there. The people that established the Hall of Fame wouldn't want him in there. And yet, if the Baseball Hall of Fame is going to capture any reasonable, picture of what the history of baseball is, not putting Marvin Miller in there is an absolute farce. And at his induction ceremony in 2020, the person who spoke about him was Donald Fear, who he had hired as general counsel in 1978, I believe, and then took over as executive director, as the second executive director after Miller. And Fear gave a really kind of long and rambling speech about Miller's impact. And this was also the same day that Derek Jeter was being inducted too. And so people were kind of antsy, and like at points you could even kind of hear the crowd groaning and maybe even like booing a little bit, Fear talking about Miller. And that image came to my mind when I was rereading your obituary about Miller and thinking about tension, and how like, to me, his legacy is like introducing the idea of tension and confrontation in circumstances where like you really need it. You really should have it. And the labor world is built on that, right? Like, it's about tension and fighting for what you believe in and feel you deserve and need. And I don't know. I mean, I think I do still see that, like, around the Players Association. I do still see the concept of tension and being willing to go to the table, and the executive subcommittee this past time around, knowing that they were really well taken care of, but still recommending no to the deal, and the rank and file saying yes to it. And so, I mean, I wonder how you think about him now. It's 12 years since he wrote that. It's obviously the world and how we organize the financials of sports have changed a lot, moved away from cable to streaming and licensing and gambling and all these different things. And so how do you kind of square his legacy 12 years removed from you having to think about it at that time?
Well, I think all the things I was just saying about, players unions today, and the way that I think players maybe don't completely take, they take a lot for granted. Unions speaks a little bit to this, right? I mean, what Marvin Miller was up against and why he talked about tension was that the players at the time knew that they wanted all these things, but they were afraid, like, if we really turn our association into a union and try to collectively bargain, isn't it going to create all this tension with these teams where we actually, we have kind of a decent relationship with our team or whatever, or this is my job, and I don't necessarily want there to always be this tension between me and my boss. And this is something that I, as an organizer, experience all the time, right? Where workers would say, like, yeah, I want all these things and I want a union, but I don't want things to be weird all the time at work and have my boss mad at me all the time and have this tension that exists. And I think what Marvin Miller said then, and is absolutely true, is he'd say to the players, the tension's already there, right? I think that what people misunderstand is the difference between tension and confrontation. What people really feared was confrontation. Like, the tension was already there because that's why they called him in. That's why they felt the need to do this, because there was an imbalance in power, and there was a group of people that were feeling like they were getting fucked over. That's the tension, right? The tension exists. They're carrying it. The workers are carrying it. The baseball players are carrying it all on their own. The owners feel no tension. They're getting everything they want, but you're already feeling all this tension. What we need is confrontation, where we push back and make the owners feel a little bit of tension. You know what I mean? It's only fair that that they should feel some of this too. And we figure this out. If we sort this out, then people will feel better in the end. But that the tension never goes away. There's always a tension between the boss and the workers. What we want to do is we want to eliminate this discomfort, this imbalance, this, and we're going to need confrontation to do that. People don't like confrontation. Marvin Miller didn't like confrontation, right? He says that the best thing was for everybody to get along, but everybody's only going to get along if everybody feels like they're being treated fairly. And if the workers feel like they're being treated fairly, they're going to get along fine with the bosses, right? And the bosses will get along with the workers. Like, he wanted to reach equilibrium, right? A sense of, where everybody felt good about the arrangement. I think he succeeded in doing that to some degree, although the fact that he didn't get into the Hall of Fame until 2020 speaks to how much he didn't succeed with his contemporaries, who blocked him from the Hall of Fame for his entire life, and then, years into his death, because they didn't, they never felt good about having to give a little bit to the workers. But, I think that was what his goal was to eliminate some of that, to minimize the tension and eliminate confrontation. But you can't wish it away. You only get rid of it by having the confrontation, right? And I think people don't like
release valve. Yeah.
Yeah, you have to have the fight. And, you're only going to have one. It was what we used to say all the time. Larry was like, well, we just need to have one fight. And if we win, if we win this fight, we'll never have to have another fight again, because we will demonstrate what the fight looks like. And then nobody will ever want to go through that again. That's what that 1972 strike was, for baseball players. Is they were like, we're going to have this fight. We're going to cost these teams a lot of money. And then they're never going to want to do that again. And they're going to realize that they don't have to, because they're still going to make money into the 80s with this deal that they're going to sign with us. He was right about that. And I think that's the thing that unions need to start to understand more, and workers need to realize, is that, sometimes you have to have a fight, but you only got to do it once. And then everybody, that's how, it's like that old thing about when you go to jail, you got to pick the biggest guy in jail and pick a fight with him to sort of show everybody that you aren't messing around. I mean, you got to do that, right? You got to stand up for yourself. If you do it once, you're not going to get bullied anymore. And I think that's the situation American workers find themselves in even today, is that they're not standing up for themselves because they fear that confrontation. But by not having it, they end up getting fucked over, and they carry this tension with them all the time.
I think Miller would often say, I will never celebrate a strike, but I will always celebrate the results of a strike, right? And I think that's kind of it right there, right? It's like no one is necessarily agitating for this, especially among ball players who've never gone through any of this before, right? But when you see the power of it, you will recognize why it's a tool in our tool belt. And I don't know. I think he was right about that.
Yeah, he was a capitalist. He was a capitalist, right. And he was unapologetically a capitalist. And he's thought of today as being this militant radical, but that's really all just context. His ideas were radical at the time; they're not anymore. You know what I mean? And and all he wanted all along was to sort of build an organization that would bring some real dignity and give these workers the power that they deserved. I mean, like I said, in context, it all feels very weird to us today because of the way we think about sports. But at the time, it was radical. So that's sort of, he's known as a radical because he was doing something very hard and very different. But his intentions were purely, as somebody who was a sports fan, a capitalist, and somebody who even had a little bit of sympathy for the owners. So I think he managed all that with aplomb, and he was able to find some balance. and the players union succeeded, well beyond what he could have imagined because of how adept he was at balancing all of that throughout his tenure.
And I think a certain understanding, even if it's not sympathy necessarily, but like an understanding with the perspective of ownership is important as a labor leader. Like, you have to understand how they think in order to understand how you play off of that as the labor side and as the union side. And he's an economist. He understands, starts his career. We go all the way back to his career.
Right.
Negotiating deals for the Wartime Labor Board, like this is where you have to understand both perspectives and try to come to a solution that is amenable to the politicians and the bureaucrats who are at the head of this organization, not just for the labor side. I mean, I think we would like to say, like, yes, we three on this podcast, maybe our political views would say, like, maybe there shouldn't be a capitalist class, but like, that's not the fight that we have here in front of us. Like, that fight has to happen somewhere else. And so,
he said that they need to be profitable for his players to make a lot of money. So his sympathy with the owners lied in that, I want you guys to be profitable. I want you guys to make a bunch of money. Just, you can't make all your money by digging into our pockets, right? Mm-hmm. You're going to have to figure out how to take the games that we're putting on and make, we're putting on the show. You got to figure out how to make more money off of that. And I think that's where his interest aligned with the bosses was, we want baseball to be profitable.
And that is the ultimate irony of the unionization of sports and Major League Baseball, is that it forced the owners to think about the fact that they had to grow the pool if they wanted to keep making the same amount of money or even more or better margins. They had to grow the pool and grow the pool and grow the pool because they couldn't just continue to get fat off fucking over players and all of the workers in their industry, even though they still would like to do that. And they still do that on every occasion that they're allowed to do that with stadium workers and whoever, part-time workers and minor leaguers and coaches and first-year analysts or whoever they can fuck over whenever possible to win the spreadsheet wars. But like, they now realize that baseball is this like 360-degree business that they needed to expand on. And that is the reason that Juan Soto makes $765 million over 15 years. Not because he is some greedy player who, has taken more than he's worth. It's because people like him, decades and decades and decades of players of making baseball more interesting, have grown the pool to the point where now his portion of it is just that big. Like, that should be the eye-opening moment, I think, for people. And a
little bit of insider trading too. I think that played into it. But.
Well, hey, now back off, my man Steve. We're not here to litigate SEC cases that are closed, Alex. God, Juan Soto's a Met. He is David Hill. You can find his writing. Where can people find all your stuff, Dave?
You can find me at davidhillonline.com. I'm on social media. I'm writing for Rolling Stone right now. I have a book called The Vapors, which you can purchase at any bookstore. I hope you would. It's almost the holiday season. It's a great book to get a dad or an uncle in your life. It does really well with dads for some reason. That's where you can find me.
Thanks so much for joining us.
Hey, thanks for having me. This was fun.
Thanks to Dave Hill. Thanks to Marvin Miller. Thanks to Korn. Thanks to Avenged Sevenfold for all their great works that propelled Alex to the point in his life that he is at now. And without them, who knows? Maybe he wouldn't have been at New York University. Maybe he wouldn't have met me in that journalism class. Who knows?
It's quite possible.
Without Avenged Sevenfold.
I might have sinister gates and M shadows to thank for my the path I took here.
We all contain multitudes of influences. We don't know how we end up places, but we do. You have Avenged Sevenfold. I have Linkin Park.
Exactly.
Different strokes, different folks. Thank you to everybody who listened. Thank you to everybody who has been listening along all month here on the Tipping Pitches Main Character Month. We've been putting a lot of work into these episodes, and I hope that it's appreciated by folks at home. And I hope that these can be kind of evergreen episodes that people come back to as ways of understanding these different characters as they go through reformations and reimaginations and all those sorts of things. Next week on the feed, the original plan was to do a kind of mini narrative series about basically the Oakland A's stadium workers, or just stadium workers and the work that they do and how it operates and how organization and how unions have impacted that work and protected that work and dignified that work. Unfortunately, the union that represents the California stadium workers also, well, this is not unfortunate for them, but unfortunately for our purposes for doing this specific episode, the union that represents them also represents hotel workers in California, and they're in the midst of a very big strike. And so in terms of organizing this conversation with the communications and the communications folks and the organizers at Unite Here, which is this union that I'm referring to, it was just a little bit too difficult to be able to pull this all together in the month of December as they're in the midst of the strike and the holidays are coming up. And so our goal is to be able to do that before the end of this off season. But in terms of main character month, we're going to have to push that back. So next week, we haven't exactly narrowed in on the plan yet. But we've talked about A-Rod, who's a player. We've talked about Rob Manfred, who's the commissioner. We've talked about Marvin Miller on this episode here, who's head of the Major League Baseball Players Association. And really, like, I think a lot of the context of tipping pitches is we talk about ownership. And so the episode that we're going to do next week, I think, is going to try to grasp like how we got to this version of the modern owner from the long lineage of ownership evolution. So we don't know exactly what shape that's going to take yet, but we'll figure something out that I assume that everybody will be on board for. But that's just me, keeping house here at the end of the pod.
Right. I'm going to go back and read and look at all of Charlie Finley's old YouTube videos where he gives grind set advice. All the podcast appearances that he did. It's really insightful stuff.
His deleted tweets are really embarrassing.
They are really embarrassing. Yeah. It's surprising he did not get canceled earlier.
Charlie Finley is uncancelable. Thank you everybody for listening. If you want to check out the Stealing Home book club conversation that we had with Eric Nussbaum, that came out this past week. On the Tipping Pitches Patreon feed. You can find out how to get access to that when you sign up at patreon.com/tippingpitches. Our top membership tier gets you access to the bonus feed. The other two tiers get you access to stuff like the Slack and other things as well, other perks as well. All that information is available on that page. Thank you to everybody who has been signing up, who has been sharing messages of support for the work that we've been doing over there. It's really funny how much more organized we are every time the off season rolls around. During the season, it's just like, yeah, I don't know, man. Something probably happened in the last week, and then the off season, we actually have to like get our shit together. So we've been putting a lot of work, and we appreciate that everybody has been appreciating it. So I think that'll do it for this week, unless you have something to add. No more corn thoughts. Do you want to hum a couple bars of your favorite corn song? People got it this far in the pod. They would love to hear you.
Right, I know. I've never been a corn guy. I'm not gonna lie. Either the food or the music, really.
Is that right? Not the food? You're not like what about like esquites?
Yeah, delicious. I love that. Actually, it's mostly just specifically corn on the cob that I struggle with.
It's just a fucking hassle. Like,
it's just a hassle. Yeah.
Like, I get that shit on my teeth for weeks.
Right. But like a little corn salsa, oh my God. It's over.
Yeah. Yeah. My mom makes like a little roasted Mexican street corn whenever we have like barbecue or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
That shit rocks, dude. I'm getting hungry just thinking about this. We gotta end this pod. Thank you everybody for listening. Thanks to Dave again. Hope you all enjoyed. We'll talk to you next week.
Hello everybody. I'm Alex Rodriguez. Tipping Pitches.
Tipping Pitches.
This is the one that I love the most.
Tipping Pitches.
So we'll see you next week. See ya!